In this lesson, we're going to be discussing classes. Our lesson objectives: learn what classes actually are, learn to construct a class, then we're going to do a brief introduction to instance variables, and another introduction to methods since they go hand in hand with constructing classes. So what is a Java class? A class is the blueprint of an object. It will contain the very framework for our operations, and it will also contain the attributes for that object. An object, if you recall from our previous video, is an instance of a class, and we create a class using a constructor. And constructors are like special methods, but these methods mimic the name of the class. So I know that this might sound like programming jargon to you right now, but it will make sense later in the video. But just know that a class encompasses the blueprint for an object, the framework, one can say. And then the object, the actual creation of the object, is done through the constructor because that constructs the object. So let's first discuss the state of our object. Within our class, the object state, or the condition that it's currently in, it is defined by data fields or instance variables. And we usually put instance variables or data fields on the top of our program. These are basically variables, and they contain sort of attributes, one could say, about our object or the state of our object. So if you look here, right, we have a string, first name, last name, grade level, GPA, rank, stuff like that describe most likely a student object, and we declare that usually with a private data field, with a private keyword, because we don't want people accessing it through that name. We want to keep that private and then maybe access it through a method later on or an operation that we create. But usually these instance variables or data fields are private. Then you have the data type. So in the case of names, it will be a string data type. In the case of grade level, it will be an integer, such as rank as well. And then GPA will be double, because I'm guessing that I'm not guessing, but GPA is generally in decimal form. But these will usually come at the top of the program underneath the public class declaration. Then we need to talk about the behavior object. Within our class, the object's behavior, otherwise what we do to check and manipulate the object, is done through the object's methods. So if you remember from our introduction to methods videos, methods have very powerful applications. It allows us to do a continuous operation multiple times just by simply calling it. Well, objects within methods allow us to check the state or check the instance variables of our object, as well as change them so that we can do some operation with them. So methods have very powerful applications within classes, within objects, because we can basically operate on the object and interact with it. So these are examples of methods. So I didn't put the code here to make it, more congested, but what I'm basically getting at is these are basically the declarations of basic methods, mutator and accessor methods. We'll get more into that in our a complete methods video, which will be very heavily filled with methods. But as for right now, you notice that these have some declaration. Generally speaking, the thing that you're accessing and like the data type of the thing you're accessing will be in the method declaration. And these have different operations, usually signified by their name. So if you look at this method name, it says get first name. Well, we're most likely going to get a first name. So it's going to probably return or print out our first name data field from our instance variables. So if you look at this instance variable, it's probably going to print out this instance variable. The get last name is probably going to get this last name and print it out. And then if you look on this side, it says set first name, set grade level, set rank. Most likely when we're creating the object, we might have made a mistake, or maybe times have passed and maybe my first name is no longer my first name. Maybe it's a year later, I'm no longer in this grade level. We need to increment or increase my grade level. Or maybe I wasn't doing so hot this year and my class rank or my GPA went down. Then we probably need to edit those instance variables. So these methods probably take in some type of value, and then they set that value and set that as the new value of these data fields. So these are what classes have. They have different data fields and they have different methods, and then these interact to create a very powerful object with many applications. So just for the sake of this video, I'm going to create a student portfolio class, and maybe in your free time, I'll probably release it later. You can create a sandwich class that probably has some type of bread, some type of patty, some type of cheese, some type of vegetable, and then maybe someone wants to change that vegetable and stuff like that. That will go in another video, or you could do that for practice, but for right now, I'm going to create a student portfolio class. So let's go to the compiler. Alrighty, so I'm in the compiler. Let me increase the size, hopefully. Alrighty, so like I said, our class is the blueprint of our program. So let's first create a student, public class student. And then since this is the framework of our class, or sorry, the framework of our object, it's going to create everything that we want a student to have or describe a student in terms of computer programming will be in between these brackets, because these brackets explain how to actually framework or create a student. So like I said, there are usually 3 types to this program. There are instance variables, and this describes the state of the object. We also have a constructor, and then this actually creates the object. And remember, the constructor is a weird type of method because the name of the method is simply the name of the class, right? There's no other method declaration. So it actually creates the object. It's a method that creates the object for the first time. And then we're going to have our special methods, which I'm going to get to later in another video, but I'm going to do a little basic introduction to show you how powerful methods can be in this type of setting. Alrighty, so let's save this. And we've basically created a student.java file that has a student class in it. And the student class is going to serve as our framework. We've already done the framework pretty much in terms of comments, but now we have to do that in terms of Java programming code. So let's make sure that everything is compiled. And yes, you can pretty much create a class and it's going to compile correctly simply because there's no syntax error. There's nothing wrong with the there's nothing wrong with the computer. But you do need to, for it to have a more powerful application or use it in a student setting, then we need to put our instance variables, our constructors, and our methods so that we can access it from another class. We can create the student object and then do some stuff with it. Alrighty, so generally speaking, what does a student have? A student has a first name, has a last name, has a grade level, has some type of GPA, and some type of rank. Now, there are probably a bunch of other, attributes that schools keep track of for their students, but this is just a basic one. These are just the basics examples so that we can go forward with our instance variables. So there's much more, and you're free to add more instance variables as you want, but we're going to do this for the sake of the video. Alrighty, cool. So first name and last name are going to most likely be strings. So the way we declare a instance, a variable, or a data field is by first naming it private. Now, generally speaking, these are private. You can have it public, there's no problem, but I'm going to put it as private because we're going to later on show you how to access these data fields through accessor methods. But it would be kind of pointless to have accessor methods if these were public, and you generally don't want these public because you don't want other classes to simply just go in head on and then change it. You want it to go through a class. Alrighty, so private, and then it's going to be string, and then it's going to be first name. Alright, and then semicolon. Now, I'm not going to put an assignment operator, otherwise the equal sign, like we do here, because we don't actually have the name of our student, right? Again, student is our framework. So we're not actually assigning first name a value yet. We're going to do that in another class when we're actually creating the student object, because we want to use the student object multiple times. We don't have just one student, right? We have hundreds of students, thousands of students even, for a school. So we want this to be simply declared so that it exists, and then our constructor is going to cover it. Ready? Private string last name. Then we have a private, and then grade level is probably going to be an integer, GPA is going to be a double, and rank is going to be a integer. So private int grade level, private double, GPA, and then we have a private int, and that's going to be rank. That's going to be rank. Alrighty, cool. So we got our data fields, we got our instance variables, and essentially what this does is that it sets the state of our student object. Whenever we create a student object, it's going to have its own first name, last name, grade level, GPA, and rank. And it's not going to be like, hey, this is going to be a name for all students, right? My name is not the same as someone else's. I mean, it could be, but it's not everybody's name. Not every student is my name, but has my name. So whenever we create a student object, it's going to have its own unique first name, unique last name, unique grade level, GPA, or rank. Alrighty, so now the constructor. What the constructor does is that it actually creates the object. It allows other classes to create a student object. So we do public class, sorry, not public class, we do public, and then it's going to be called student. Alrighty. Now this is just like a method in that it gets arguments. So if you remember from our introduction to methods video, right, we have our method declaration. Now this method declaration is probably going to be the most different method declaration you're probably ever going to see, but because this is a different type of method altogether, it's a constructor method. But just know that it acts like a method in that you can basically access it. Alrighty, so public student, because that is the name of our class, so it will mimic the name of our class. And then we are going to take in how many arguments. So since this actually creates our object, then we want a value for first name, last name, grade level, GPA, and rank to be inputted so that this constructor can create the object. So it's going to get a string first name, right? It's going to get a string last name. It's also going to get a integer grade level. It's going to get a double, and it's probably going to be my GPA, and then it's going to have a rank, so rank. Alrighty, make sure that these are commas and not semicolons. Remember that semicolons are come after the end of statements. Alrighty, then our brackets, because this is a method after all. And then since this constructor takes in values, then we have to set this equal to the first name. We have to set this last name that another class gave to this constructor, and then we set it to our last name. So it's going to be fn. Sorry, it's going to be first name, and then we're going to set that equal to fn. And we do the same with every single instance variables. Now there is another way of actually doing this. There's a much faster way, but I'm going to teach you that trick once you get the gist of how to create the object. So last name is going to be equal to ln. Then it's going to be grade level is equal to GL. GPA is going to be equal to my GPA. And then rank is going to be equal to R. Alright, cool. So let's actually create the object. So let's make sure that this can compile correctly. So this did compile correctly simply because we have our class, we have our data fields, and we have our constructor. The constructor, again, will be used to create the object. Alrighty. So let's create a class. Let's create another Java file, and we're gonna call this public class student demo. And what student demo does is that it's gonna include our main method, because what does the compiler do? It finds the main method and then it compiles the main method. So if you recall, this is simply just a framework for our class, right? This is a framework for an object. It's not going to include a main method because we are creating a object. This is our framework. But now we're creating a demo that actually creates the student object. And it's much like a scanner class once you test it out. So public static void main string args. So that is our method declaration. That is our main method declaration. So how do we do this? So we have a student object. So if you recall, how did we create a scanner object? We created a scanner object like this. Scanner, well, we first imported it, but just for the sake of it, we're going to do scanner my scanner is equal to new scanner system.in. So let's analyze this pretty quickly. So scanners actually, what we actually do when we're doing the import statement, when we're importing the scanner class, is that we're importing, just like how we have the student class here, we're actually importing a scanner class that doesn't have a main method, but it has a framework for a scanner. So we call it by the class name. That is our scanner. And then we name our scanner object, right? So when we're creating the student object, we're most likely going to have an identifier. So whenever we want to access our student object. Now this is an assignment operator, so what this entire declaration does is that it allocates memory for our scanner, and then it names it my scanner, so that whenever we're accessing it by our from our IDE or integrated developer environment, we call it through this. So this declares it and it's allocated. But how do we actually create it? Well, we create it by setting an assignment operator, and then we call it by this new keyword. And then what this new keyword does, it's saying, hey, I want to create a new scanner. But how do you create a new scanner? Well, you access the scanner's constructor. This scanner has its own constructor. So in terms of, when you're creating a student object, you're most likely going to call out the student constructor. In this case, you're calling out a scanner constructor and has some weird system.in argument that you don't need to worry about. But understand this is where the constructor is being accessed. So our arguments, so whatever we want to make our instance variables, will be within these parentheses. Alrighty, so I hope that cleared it up regarding how to actually create the object. So now let's create the object, the student object. So we're going to do student, and let's name it first student, right? Just for the sake of, keeping everything simple. First student, right? You can name it whatever you want, but I'm going to have it as first student, and I'm going to do new student. So what are we doing? We're creating, or we're declaring that we want to create a student object. Much like how we say, hey, I want to create an integer x or a double y, we want to create a student object. In this case, it's going to be called first student. So whenever we access first student, or want to change it, or want to, see what's up with first student, how do we describe first student? Then, well, we're going to access it through this name. And then this entire declaration, what it does is that it allocates memory for that student object. It allocates some sort of memory for these strings, these integers, these doubles, and, well, this other integer. And then all the methods that should be attached with it. Now, this is the actual assignment or creation of the student object. So this was simply allocating memory. So this whole thing is, if you just left this as a semicolon and then ended it there, it would have allocated the memory, but this entire thing would have been null or just non-existent. There's nothing pretty much there. But when you put the equal sign or the assignment operator there, and then tie with a new keyword and then accessing the constructor, then you're actually creating the object. So the new tells the compiler that we want a new object. We want a new student object. And then it's like, alrighty, how do I create that new student object? Well, we do it through the student constructor. So what does the student constructor have? So our constructor is right over here. Public student string fn, so it needs a first name, a last name, a grade level, a GPA, and a rank. So let me write this down. A first name, a last name, a grade level, a GPA, and a rank. Alrighty, cool. So we're gonna have our parentheses, and then the values inside these brackets have to correspond with the values or the data types that we want in these parentheses. So our first value was a first name. It needed a first name, and then it needed a last name. So we're most likely going to put a string here. So a string, what should be our first string name? Let's put Tony. And then we needed a last name because the next value of our argument is a last name because, well, ln is going to be assigned to last name. So it's going to be, we'll just put S, I guess, for now. Alrighty, so we have two strings that correspond with the arguments of our student constructor. Now we need a grade level, GPA, and rank. So grade level, let's put 12. Maybe he has a 3.99 GPA. And class rank we'll keep as 1. Hopefully that number is in the correct order. So grade level, GPA, double GPA, and then integer rank. Alrighty, cool. So let's save this file. And let's save it in the same folder that we had our student class. Alrighty. So we made sure that this can compile correctly, right? Now we need to check if this can compile correctly. And let's run it. And it does nothing at all. But you might be surprised. What it does is that it actually creates a student object, and that student has a name of Tony. It has a last name of S, has a grade level of 12, a GPA of 3.99, and a class rank of 1. So these values are in here. Don't believe me? So let's actually create a method, and that is going to print out all the values that we have for first name, last name, grade level, GPA, and rank. So if we know from our methods video, we need to create a method signature. Now you might not know every word in this, but just please follow along. So we're going to have public, we're going to have a void, and let's name it get details. And since it's not going to be taking any input, we're going to empty the parentheses. Just like how the constructor, well, not just like, unlike the constructor that took these values from another class, if these arguments, and then sets it as the value here, this is not going to be taking any arguments. It's just simply going to print out values. And just like a method, it will have curly brackets. Now what do we do? Well, we're going to print out the first name, last name, grade level, GPA, and rank. So system.out.println first name and then I'm just going to copy this print statement just for the sake of simplicity. Okay, so instead of first name, it's going to be last name. Then we're going to have a grade level. Then a GPA. And then a rank. Let me make sure it's called rank. All right, cool. Alrighty, so let's compile. Alrighty, cool. So we have our method, our first method. And we're going to expand on these methods later, but this is for the sake of this video. I just want to show you that we're actually creating a student object. Alrighty, so how do we actually access this get details method? Well, this is where the name first student comes in. The way we access it is by saying first student, because that is the name of our class, and then we're going to do get details. Now what I'm going to do actually right now is I'm going to print this out. And this is just simply to separate it. You'll see why in a second. This will allow me to basically separate all the, well, values if we do this multiple times. So if we're printing this get details thing multiple times, then, well, we're going to include this to separate it from every instance. It's basically there for a convenience to, when you're looking at it, it's more easier to separate all that data based on lines than to find the first name every single time. Alrighty, so compile, and then we'll run. And, well, before we look at the output, because the output is right there, it's going to be like, already, I want to create a student object. I'm going to name it first student. Already, we have the space allocated. Now let's create the student object. It's going to have a first name of Tony, a last name of, well, S. It's going to have a grade level of 12, a double GPA of 3.99, and a class rank of 1. So does it print it out? Yes, it does. Let me actually make this a little bit bigger. There you go. See? It prints out the instance variables, the data field. So it actually does create an object. There is an object, and then when we, describe the object, through the get details method, it prints out the instance variables that we told the compiler to print out. So if you're wondering, what is the point of this? Well, this can be very powerful when you're managing a school system. You want to keep information of every single student. So the reason why I said first student was most likely because I was implying that there was going to be a second and third student. So second student is going to be equal to new student, and we're going to probably put like Fazan A. Let's put 11 4.00. Then we'll put like maybe class rank of 5. And then maybe a third student rather, and we'll call it, we create a new student, and we have maybe a name of Vic, and then a last name of I, grade 10, 3.88 GPA, and let's say a class rank of 3. Just for the sake of time. Alrighty, so we've created 3 students. Now let's find the details. Let's make sure that the object gets created. We've basically created 3 different student objects. We've created 3 different students, and each student has these unique data types, basically things that describe our object, that describe our student. Before we do that, we're going to get the details of every single student. Want to make sure that is a comma. Alrighty, cool. Because that is an integer, not a double. And let's run it. And cool. So what it does, I think I scrolled a little bit too fast there. But as you can see, what it does is that it creates our student of the first 3 student objects. So it creates this student object with the name of Tony, a second student object with the name of Fozan, and a third student object with the name of Vic, all with their own last name. They could share the same last name. It's not a problem, because it's set in their own. They get their own last name. They get their own They get their own grade level, they get their own last name, they get their own first name. So it's not unique, but they get their own variable, and it could be the same. They could have the same grade level, they could have the same GPA. That's not going to affect the program because this first student is independent from this second student. So you can't combine them. I mean, you can combine them in a later chapter when you're combining classes and you want to interact between the classes. That is not a problem. But for the sake of this video, they are independent. So this first name, it that has no correlation with this first name, which has no correlation with this first name. Even though it could be the same, even though they could be in the same grade level, they have no correlation because they're stored in completely different places on the computer. And that is why that when we're accessing it, even though we're accessing the same variable name, it accesses completely different names, last names, and grade levels, because it's accessing it in terms of the student object. So when the first student get details method gets executed, it's going to access the first name, last name, grade level, GPA, class rank of Tony, or the first student object. For the second student object, it's going to access the first name, last name, grade level, GPA, and class rank of the second student being Fozhan, and he's going to have his own data types for his class. And then for the third one, because you want to test it out to make sure that it works again, you're going to have a third student, and this third student is going to have his own first name, last name, grade level, GPA, and class rank that is independent from the other variables, and that is seen because the compiler executes these names with their unique data types. And all of these data types, when they get printed, describe the student. This output describes the third student. The instance variables of each student class, or each instance of a class, describe the student. And that is very powerful. We've basically modeled a student in terms of computer programming. We've created a computer object. We've created an object, and while we do that through a class, which is the blueprint of our object, it's the framework. So our student is going to have its own attribute. It's going to have some way to create it because you want a way of creating the object. And then it's going to have its methods. For the sake of this video, I've obviously went pretty simple and did a basic method that prints out all the attributes. But you'll have more powerful applications later that allow you to change this. And once you do that, you've created a student object that you can change, you can edit, and it's a way of managing the system. It's a way of putting a student into a file or putting him into terms of a computer language. And that is our video on classes. As you can see, classes, it's pretty simple once you get to know it, but they have very powerful applications in object-oriented programming.